This project is framed by an argument between Tennessee poet, writer, and artist Emma Bell Miles and Czechoslovakian composer Antonin Dvorak. In 1892, Dvorak was hired as the director of the National Conservatory of Music in New York. As director, he advocated for the admission of Black Americans to the conservatory because he believed, and I quote, "The future of music in this country must be founded upon what are called the Negro melodies." He also wrote, "These beautiful and varied themes are the product of the soil. They are American." Professor Dvorak continued this line of argument in Harper's New Monthly in 1895 in his article, Music in America. It was most likely this article that inspired Miles to write her 1904 rebuttal, Some Real American Music. Published in Harper's Monthly, Miles argued, and I quote, "Dvorak and a few other composers have indeed made use of Negro themes, and the Aboriginal Indian music has been seriously treated more than once. But these compositions, however excellent, are no expression of American life and character. They fall as strangely on our ears as any foreign product." Emma Bell Miles was active in circulating the widespread and mistaken belief that all mountain music is white. The goal of this research is to preserve a piece of African American culture that was nearly erased from the rural Appalachian community where it was born. This project explores a group of young African American musicians who lived 65 miles northwest of Emma Bell Miles in Warren County at the westernmost edge of the Cumberland Plateau, where they contributed to a rich but nearly forgotten American legacy of rural Black string band music. How did 3 generations of African American musicians and their music survive slavery, survive the failure of Reconstruction, and survive the Jim Crow South? What was distinct about their music? What can we learn from their music and their stories? To answer these questions, my project first looked at the historiography and culture of Black Americans in Warren County. I have also looked at the history and the largely forgotten Southern rural Black string band music, how it was shaped by segregation, and how the Black string band, Gribble, Lusk, and York, is placed within this historical context. I argue that the music of John Lusk, Murphy Gribble, and Albert York was not only a sustaining source of cultural survival, it was also a representation of what Miles called an expression of American life and character. Their music helps dispel the Jim Crow account that only white music was real American music. Their music undermines the notion of racial purity in the Appalachian music, a narrative circulated by white supremacists in the Mountain South, a narrative that most likely began long before the Civil War ended. The Black music culture in this history will travel from slavery to sharecropping and tenant farming, to street performing, to all-day music parties and Saturday square dances, from moonshine to winemaking, and to manual labor for Walker's Lumber Company. This historical account of the music will, by necessity, include the struggle of survival for these Black Americans who contended with poverty, with marginal literacy, and with the constraints of Jim Crow segregation. This is McMinnville, Warren County, Tennessee in 1863. I've been able to trace these musicians back to the white slave owners who lived on neighboring farms in Warren County. The first musicianer, a term from mountain dialect used here to focus on the instrumentalists, was a man named Jefferson, or Jeff. Born into slavery, most likely around 1820, on the farm of William Lowry Lusk. A fiddler was important to the slave culture on small farms as well as large farms. Most of the slave owners in Warren County were small planters. They wanted to have fiddle music available for their entertainment and to have some control over slave amusements. William Lusk and Thomas Gribble, both Scotch-Irish and small planters, were slavers who lived on neighboring farms. They were connected by distance, by heritage, by religion, and most likely their love of music. William Lusk sent Jeff to New Orleans, most likely in the mid-1840s, to learn to play fiddle. Charles Wolfe commented, "This appears to have been commonplace in the region." Round-trip passage by steamboat from Nashville, I love this, from Nashville to New Orleans, round trip took 15 days. From the Caney Fork River near Warren County, boats navigated up the Cumberland River to Nashville, joining the Ohio River in Kentucky, then down the Mississippi to New Orleans. This is an 1850 lithograph of the steamboat Missouri, built in 1845. It was one of the steamboats used for passenger travel from Memphis to New Orleans. Lawrence Levine said, "Culture is not a fixed condition, but a process, the product of interaction between the past and the present," end quote. The enslaved from Africa brought with them many separate traditions, as well as many separate languages. Separated from their homes and their families, these slaves were able to create their own surprisingly unified culture, a culture that became an agent for survival. The frolic was an integral part of this culture. Saturday was the designated day of the recreation for the enslaved, and the frolic was the acceptable slave community activity throughout the rural South. The frolic consisted of the musicianers, sometimes called secular ministers, the dancers, and the audience. Much like the preacher was in charge of the congregation, the musicianers were in charge of the frolic. The frolic in the form of a fish fry continued to exist in Warren County well into the first half of the 20th century. The setting for the fish fry was Murphy Gribble's land in a community called Shady Rest. This is, the road there is Dogtown Road. And in the Jameson article, the initial Jameson article that was published, he talked about driving down this road, which was a dirt road, and they got stuck in the mud. Well, this isn't far from where their car was stuck. And this was Murphy Gribble's farm. He had smokers. They ran moonshine. They had fish fries. This was the place where it happened near McMinnville. Jeff Lusk's grandchildren, John Lusk, Murphy Gribble, and Albert York, that's right, they all had the same grandfather. They were the third generation of musicianers. They played their distinctive music, a distinctive form of square dance music every Saturday for close to 30 years on the same street corner, busking for white passersby in front of the First National Bank in downtown McMinnville. If you had been there in 1928, this is what you might have heard. The name of this tune is Old Sage Friend. Old Sage Friend is perhaps one of the oldest tunes that they recorded. The square dances did not happen in this building. This building was built in 1958-ish, but before this schoolhouse was built, this was the site of the original schoolhouse where they held the square dances. And it was quite an event to try to get the state to pitch in money to rebuild the schoolhouse. But this is now a community center there, but I don't think it's used for anything now. But this was the site of the Saturday square dances. Some of the street corner repertoire, on the street corner at the First National Bank, this consisted mostly of the white music that would be recognized by white passersby, and they busked. We call it up north busking for music. They got money for the street corner, playing on the street corner. Old Sage Friend was one of these tunes, and the street corner repertoire was recorded. That's most of the recordings that were done by the Library of Congress by Stuart Jameson and Margot Mayo back in 1946. John Lusk never called himself the leader of the band, but usually the fiddler is the leader and calls the tunes. Black fiddling has been described as rough, scraping, sawing, and jerking, which was distinct from smooth, clear, or notey to describe fiddling identified with whites. Lusk was a virtuoso. He fell somewhere in between these two descriptions. His son, Frank Duncan Lusk, said it was a gift. Murphy Gribble described his own banjo style as broke-legged rhythm. Gribble said he had been playing that style since before 1914. He said that was the way black folks always played. Albert York held up the universe with his guitar. His contribution was steady rhythm, much like a stand-up bass. When interviewed by Charles K. Wolfe in 1977, Frank Duncan Lusk talked about the versatility of his father, saying that he could play anything. He could play all instruments. He also said Murph Gribble played fiddle and banjo. When one got tired of playing fiddle, they would switch off. Much of the group's known public repertoire mirrored white string band music, such as Billy and the Low Ground. Other tunes reflected a more personal black string band tradition, such as Old Sage Friend that we've already heard. Old Sage Friend is said to have been a signature piece that was played by John Lusk's grandfather, Jefferson Lusk. After Margot Mayo and Stuart Jameson's recording in 1946 for the Library of Congress, Stuart Jameson returned to campaign in 1949. The later recording session is the one that brought us Altamont. And Altamont is another tune from the black string tradition. Here's a picture of John Lusk on the left. This is it's really hard to see, but on the left, that's a 1950-ish picture of how he might have looked when Jameson was there. The picture on the right is the full picture with his wife, Lena, on the far right, and two of his children on the bottom row, and his son-in-law on that's standing. recorded John Lusk and his son Duncan, and these recordings have never been published. And that's part of my my goal, is to see that some of those recordings get published. During this recording, you can hear John Lusk say that he learned 3 of these tunes from Murph's father. And that's the first indication we have of the continuation of the music. And one of these tunes was called A Feelin' Piece. I don't think that was the name of the tune, but that's what Murph's father called it, A Feelin' Piece. We Wear the Mask by Paul Laurence Dunbar. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts we smile and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. John Lusk, Murphy Gribble, and Albert York were family. As band members, they never played alone after Murphy Gribble returned from World War I, and they never let down their guard. During the recording session in 1946, all 3 wore fedora hats to hide their faces. Stuart Jameson noticed that the hats remained in place throughout the recording session. He was concerned for them because not one person in the white audience wore a hat. Then it hit Jameson that they were not making themselves at home. Jameson thought they were pretending they were really not there. He may have been right, but was the mask the fedora hats, or was it the music? This is John Lusk's fiddle. His fiddler has become emblematic of the Americanness of this family. The label inside reads, Henry Farney, 1908. Beginning around 1908, the Wurlitzer Company began importing medium-grade fiddles and selling them through the Sears and Roebuck catalog. These fiddles, once they got them into this country, they slapped a label, Henry Farney, or as some people call Henri Farney, if they wanted to be fancy. And the cost for this fiddle, which is a Maggini-style fiddle with case bow, extra strings, rosin, and an instruction book, was $4.25. Now, in 1908, that was a lot of money. While I was sitting in Frank Duncan Lusk's son Charlie's living room, Charlie's wife, Georgia, who actually is a relative of DeFord Bailey, his wife, Georgia, remembered that John's fiddle had been hanging on Frank Duncan's half-brother James' wall for perhaps 40 years. When James died, another brother, Robert, took the fiddle, locked it in an attic, and James died in John died in 1969. James died in 2009. So this fiddle was locked in an attic for 20 years until I met Sylvia, Robert's daughter, and she remembered the fiddle was in the attic. Well, no, that would be 10 years. 1908, yeah, 10 years, sorry. She went and got the fiddle and brought it to the library in McMinnville. And here is Sylvia and her fiddle, and I picked up the fiddle. It was glorious. It had no cracks in the back. The fingerboard was separated, and the strings were loose, but it was in fairly good shape. But but it was quite an event. And the Smithsonian, I've been in touch with them, and they would really like it there, but Sylvia doesn't want to give away the fiddle, so I can't blame her for this. And this was the family. On the left is Frances, a granddaughter, Sylvia, a granddaughter, and then some great grandkids. And then on the far right is Harold, a grandson, and sitting with me is Charlie, and he's the one that has pointed me every step of the way. That's the Lusk family.